I'm Priya Sundaration. It's my honor to be the host today, and it's my honor to introduce to you the speakers for today, who will be presenting on the areas of expertise. We have Callie Kozlak, Associate Superintendent for Policy and Government Relations at the Arizona Department of Education. Fred Yamashita, the Executive Director of the Arizona AFL-CIO. Laura Dent, the Executive Director of Chispa, Arizona and the League of Conservation Voters. David Lujan, the Interim President and CEO of the Children's Action Alliance. Ana Karina Rodriguez from the Arizona Civic Engagement Program Manager at the Domestic Workers Alliance. And Will Humble, sorry if I said the title wrong, Will Humble, the Executive Director of the Arizona Public Health Association. So we have a really great lineup. We're very excited to hear from all of these speakers. Let's turn it over to David Lujan first. Again, David Lujan is the Interim President and CEO of the Children's Action Alliance. He's also an expert in the Arizona budget and will be giving us a presentation, a deeper dive into the budget, what the state budget is and what it isn't.
Thank you, Priya. Good morning, everyone. I'm David Lujan. As said, I actually have two titles right now. I'm the Interim President and CEO of Children's Action Alliance, but I'm also the Director of the Arizona Center for Economic Progress. And it's as the Director of the Arizona Center for Economic Progress that I speak to you today. The Arizona Center for Economic Progress is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on advancing the policies that are going to create better economic opportunities for all Arizonans. And that's really where I wanted to start my presentation today, is talking about what are the things that we should be doing in Arizona to create better economic opportunities for all Arizonans, for our communities, so that everybody has the opportunity to thrive. And I think we've had a pretty good lesson over the past year about who creates jobs in our economy, and that's all of us. It's everyday people, everyday Arizonans. We saw over the past year that when people stop going to restaurants and stop going out shopping and going out and buying things and doing activities and traveling, that slows down business. It stops jobs. People lose their jobs. And so if we want to create jobs, it's all of us who are the job creators. And if we put money in people's pockets, if we give them jobs, if we give them the opportunity to get an education, then that is what helps to grow our economy and helps our economy to flourish. And so if we don't have the resources and the infrastructure around us to be able to work and to get an education, then our economy is gonna suffer. If we don't have the roads to get to our jobs, if we don't have housing, so that we have to move from one community to the other, so where it's difficult to keep a stable job. If we don't have quality schools in our neighborhoods so that our kids are getting the education that they will need to have the skills to get jobs in the future. If we don't have access to affordable childcare so that we have a place for our children to go while we go to work or get an education. All of those things are the types of things that we depend on to be able to work and get education. And they're the things, the supports that we pay our tax dollars for to support us in moving our economy and moving things forward. And as was talked about a little bit, we are right now going through, this is a critical time because this is the time of the year that our state legislature, our state lawmakers do one of the most important roles that they play, and that is creating a state budget. And the state budget really is such an important piece of how are they going to use our tax dollars to reinvest in our communities, to provide those things that we need to be able to get jobs, to work and do those types of things. And so it's really an important time to be focusing on what our elected leaders at the state capitol are doing to make sure they're making the right decisions and they're spending our tax dollars in a manner that will lift up our communities and give us the opportunities to move up the economic ladder. Unfortunately, in Arizona, for probably the last 3 decades, the people that we've sent and the people who have been in power at the legislature have focused more on giving tax breaks to corporations and the rich rather than investing in those things that I talked about. And for 3 decades, Arizona has trailed the rest of the country in providing its citizens with those types of things that we depend on, like funding for public education, good roads, affordable housing, affordable childcare. And so that's why as the legislature starts to consider the budget this year, it's going to be critically important for all of us to weigh in to make sure that they are making the investments in our economy, in our future, that will create an economy that is for the people, a people first economy. And now more than ever, that is critical because of the pandemic. We have so many people in Arizona who are struggling because of the pandemic through this health and economic crisis. And if there was ever a more important year for our state legislature to not give tax cuts to the rich and corporations, but instead to make sure that any resources that we have available, make sure we're investing those things in our community to help lift up all Arizonans. Now is such an important time because of the COVID pandemic and because so many Arizonans are struggling. And this health and economic crisis that we have faced for the last year has been unlike any other economic crisis that we have faced in this country before, because even when you look at like the Great Recession a decade ago, and most economic downturns in the past, most economic downturns hit all segments of our population fairly hard. But this particular economic and health crisis has particularly hit those at the low income and the middle income families, people of color, rural communities. And it's been very different in terms of there still a whole segment of our society, particularly those at the top, big companies that have not felt the ramifications of this as much as the people at the lower end. And so that is why it's important that any tax dollars that we have that are available to increase investments, that we're increasing those investments and giving people the resources to come out of this health and economic crisis stronger than before. And the slide you see on your screen, I'll show you just a few other slides, are just to give you some background on just how much Arizonans are struggling right now over the past year because of the pandemic. 2.5 million Arizona households have had at least one member lose employment. And so that, a number of people have lost their jobs. And then next slide. And then, as I said, it's hit people at the lower end of the income scale much more significantly than those at the top. For those households that make $50,000 a year or less, of those households, 1 in 2 of those households have lost employment income over the last year. Next slide. And then households with children are facing particular hardships in terms of not having enough food to put on the table, not sure whether they're going to be able to pay the rent for the next month. And so, these are types of things that state governments can help with in terms of providing supports and making sure that we're providing the affordable housing and the rental assistance and those types of things. And that's all budget types of decisions that our state legislature will be making over the next year. And so we'll skip ahead, I think, a couple of slides. And I think they're going to make these slides available. So I'm really meant for these slides to be sort of as background for people to be able to look at later. Next slide. If I should go one more slide. Okay. And so here's some of the good news if it's used correctly. And that is, as the legislature starts to look at the budget for next year, our lawmakers actually have a revenue surplus, meaning they've got the revenue that they need to make the investments in the things we're talking about in childcare, in affordable housing, in education, fixing our roads. As according to the budget experts down at the state capitol, our lawmakers will have about $2 billion in additional revenue that they can use to invest in our communities over the next year. And of that $2 billion, about 1.6 billion is for one-time spending types of things, and about $400 million is for ongoing spending. And so what that means is one-time spending things in the budget are things that are they only have to pay for once. So things like improving our roads, making, types of construction projects, fixing our schools, fixing the roofs on schools, for example, one-time expenditures that are not going to be expenditures that they'll have to make over and over again year after year. Whereas the $400 million for ongoing revenue is money that can be used for ongoing needs, like increasing teacher salaries, or increasing unemployment benefits, or increasing childcare subsidies, or increasing the amount of funding we have in our affordable housing trust fund. Things that you want to see being allocated year after year. So we have a $2 billion revenue surplus. A lot of that is for one-time needs, but about $400 million, which is pretty significant amount, could be used for ongoing revenue. That's the good news. Our lawmakers have choices. They've got the revenue to make the good choices and invest in our communities. The bad news is the reports that we're getting out of the state capitol and the public comments of many of our legislators is, instead of taking this $2 billion and reinvesting it in our communities, many of the legislators in power want to give that money in the form of tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy. And so that is not investing in our communities. That's not going to invest and put money in people's pockets so that they can create those jobs. And so, unfortunately, our legislature has sort of followed that path for much of the last 3 decades. Instead of investing in our communities, they have year after year given tax cuts. And those tax cuts often don't go to most of us. They don't go to everyday Arizonans. Many of the tax cuts that they've enacted over the past 30 years have been special interest tax breaks that go to the rich, go to corporations, and that is not the way to invest in our future, not the way to invest in people. And I want to go back one slide. I got my slides out of order, but if we can go back to that one. This kind of gives you in a graphic representation of what's happened in Arizona over the past 3 decades. Because as I mentioned, our state legislature has cut taxes every single year but one since 1990. And what this graph is showing you is it's showing state revenue and state investments going back all the way to the 1970s. And the line that you see in the middle is about 1992. That's when they started cutting taxes every year. And you can see that leading up to 1992, Arizona was fairly stable or trending up in terms of the amount of revenue we were bringing in every year, and correspondingly, the amount of money we were investing in things like schools and affordable housing and childcare. But once the legislature started to cut taxes every year, you can see that the lines for how much revenue we were collecting has been on a steady downward trend. And not surprisingly, the amount of money that we have then to invest in things has been also steadily declining. And here's the important thing to remember. If our legislators want to cut taxes at the state legislature, it only takes a simple majority. It takes a 50% plus one to cut taxes at the legislature. But if they want to do away with a tax cut that's not working, or if they want to raise taxes to make more investments in education and other things, it takes a supermajority vote, 2/3 of the legislature, to pass it in order to do away with bad tax cuts. That's a law that was passed in 1992, that supermajority requirement. And ever since that supermajority requirement has been in place, it has been virtually impossible for the legislature to do away with bad tax cuts or to raise revenue for the things that we want to see investments in. And that's why this year is so important, because we've got $2 billion in revenue that we don't have to raise taxes. We've got that revenue that we can use and we can invest in our communities. But instead, they want to give that revenue away in the form of tax cuts. And if the legislature passes those tax cuts, because of that supermajority requirement to undo them, we will never get that revenue back, and we will lose the opportunity to invest in our communities. And so that's why years like this, when we have the revenue and when we have so much need in our communities, it's critically important that we're asking our lawmakers to do the right thing and invest in our people, invest in an economy that puts people first. I think that's about all I really want to cover. I know we've got some other slides, but if you want to just slide through the next one, I'll see if there's anything important that I missed. I know you're going to come back to me. We can skip that one. And here's just kind of the bottom line. I mean, and I don't think I have to tell many of you this, and you heard our speakers on the videos beforehand. All of those tax cuts that we've seen for the past 30 years has meant that they are disinvesting in our communities. They're not investing, they're taking resources out of our communities in the form of fewer funds for affordable housing. Our schools, we all know our schools have been hurting for years. Our community colleges, universities, funding that people depend on for childcare supports, all of those things have been consistently going down in terms of funding. And so now is the time, when so many Arizonans are struggling, when we've got this additional revenue, let's invest it in our communities instead of giving it away in the form of tax breaks to corporations and the rich. I think that's the next slide I want to show you. Go to the next one. Oh, I forgot. Well, there's one other slide. That's right. I had it on mine because I thought I was going to share my slides. So there's one slide I want to show you. I'll come back later in the presentation. A number of people across Arizona are coming together to work together to ensure that we are investing in an economy that puts people first, a people first economy. And so we have a website called peoplefirsteconomy.com. And so that's a really good website to go to stay in touch, to know how you can be involved, because the good news is that the people at the state capitol work for us. They are elected to represent us, to represent our communities. And so we don't have to just take this, whatever they decide to do. We need to be able to raise our voices and talk to them and tell them, we want to see the investments in our communities. We want to see them using this revenue surplus to invest in people. And now is the time to be doing that. And so I will pause there and turn it over back to Priya.
We'll, of course, hear more from David as we go through the great set of panels that we have. Right now, we'll turn it over to a video that we have from Callie Kozlak that will go a little bit more into the education piece of it. Callie Kozlak is an Associate Superintendent for Policy and Government Relations at the Arizona Department of Education.
For 2021, the Arizona Progress Meter ranked Arizona 50th across the nation in teacher pay. So that is very telling of where we stand when it comes to budget adequacy. In Arizona, we have a lot of policy that promotes school choice. But with school choice comes a need for more resources to sustain a variety of options and all of those operational costs. And so our budget needs to catch up with that. The Department of Education is addressing the issue of teacher pay and teacher recruitment and retention through a variety of ways. This is number one priority for Superintendent Hoffman and many of the staff that work at the department. We have created an educator recruitment and retention team at the department that is examining a lot of the root causes and issues around that. We are intending to continue to try and elevate the teaching profession. There are actually a lot of teachers that are professionals that have their certifications with the department, but they're not teaching in classrooms. So I think looking at ways to get those certified teachers back into the classrooms. With COVID, we know that our teachers have faced so much in terms of having to manage, sort of having to do online school and hybrid options in person, as well as their own children's education, which has been very taxing. So we want to ensure we're providing social emotional supports to teachers as well. We have done during COVID, provided sort of on-demand online training courses to support teachers in having to navigate all those different modalities of instruction. And then we're continuing to look at options for how do we promote and recruit teachers in some of our remote areas as well, and to ensure that we are looking at issues of teacher diversity too, so that our teachers are reflective of the students they serve. The $3.88 billion is from the American Rescue Plan, as well as the two prior recovery packages. The recovery package that was passed in May of 2020, and then another one that was passed in December of 2020. With Proposition 208, if it stays in place, my understanding is that the higher tax rate applies to income earned in 2021. So that therefore the funds won't really start rolling until spring of 2022. From our understanding is revenue could potentially begin coming in now if folks in that those upper brackets are setting aside the tax portion and then submitting it throughout the year. But the assumption is that it will come with the following tax year. Some of that is dependent on sort of actions by the Department of Revenue. The best way for Arizonans to communicate their concerns about budget to the governor is to utilize typical advocacy platforms, social media, other types of things that advocates do to communicate their concerns. I would say that legislators and the governor and other public officials really do care what constituents say and what stakeholders say. So I think it's important for folks, especially those who are involved with our schools, the school administrators, for example, to be at the legislature and meeting with the governor too when they have the opportunity to share their concerns from the community. I would also say leaning on the U.S. congressional delegation as well to let them know what's happening in Arizona, particularly with the use of federal dollars and concerns about how those dollars may be being spent by state officials.
David, do you have any thoughts on that or any additional detail that you can talk about the budget relating to education?
I guess I would just add one thing, and Callie mentioned the significant amount of federal dollars that we're getting from the American Rescue Plan, which is tremendous. That is truly landmark legislation in terms of being able to lift people out of poverty and provide resources. But one thing I want to make sure that people know is that the American Rescue Plan and any of the federal relief dollars that we've received over the past year are one-time dollars. And that's why it's so important us to be also now focusing at the state legislature and the state capitol, because it's our state lawmakers that are going to provide the revenue and the investments after this federal dollars go away after the next year or two. And so that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about making the investments in our state budget, is making sure that once these federal dollars go away that are so critical, that we're going to continue to make those investments in our communities.
Well, now we will move on to our next segment, which is healthcare. And in order to kick that off, we have a video from Will Humble, who is the Executive Director of the Arizona Public Health Association.
Here's the way when I teach classes to students, here's the way I characterize the public health system in Arizona. Whereas your county health departments are your public health retailers. So those are the folks that have the TB control programs. They're the folks that inspect the restaurants. They're the folks that actually run the WIC clinics, women, infant, and children clinics. They're the one that run the vaccination programs. They're the ones that do the epidemiology. That's the boots on the ground workforce for public health in Arizona. The state's role, the Arizona Department of Health Services role, I always viewed it when I was in my job as we're the public health wholesaler. Our job is to draw down as many resources as we can from the federal government so that we can pass that through to our retailers so they can move their public health product through those safety net programs and other public health programs. And at the same time, we're the interface with the state legislature where we can try to help inform them before and during legislative session about the pluses and minuses of the various bills when it comes to public health outcomes. The state health department's job is we apply for grants, whether it's HRSA, CDC, WIC, what have you, and then build deliverables that make sense for the county health departments to invest in the kinds of programs at the local level that make improvements. Now, with the CARES Act money that came through Congress, I view that not as public health infrastructure spending, but rather emergency response spending that would provide governors with an opportunity to build a safety net so that they could implement public health interventions to help slow the spread of this virus. And many governors looked at it that way, where they saw the money as an opportunity to say, for example, improve unemployment insurance benefits, because if you needed to shut bars, restaurants, and nightclubs for a period of time, you had some sympathy for the workers within those programs and the business owners. And so the CARES Act money, in my view, should have been used to build safety net programs to help allow you to responsibly implement interventions at the community level to help slow the spread of the virus, recognizing that some of those interventions have real life impacts on the ability for people to make a living. Our governor never really looked at it that way, in my view. Some of the money he did use for infrastructure, for that kind of spending around housing and so forth. And he did use some of that CARES Act money for that purpose, but he also took $400 million of CARES Act money and backfilled state agency general fund budgets to essentially, and I'll just call it what I think it is, which is laundering money back into state agencies for expenses that those agencies have already incurred and would have incurred normally on any other year, and backfilled that and essentially used that money as opposed to using it to, for example, boost unemployment insurance benefits in December, January, and February, when he responsibly, I should say they, talking about Dr. Christ as well, they could have implemented a safety net so that there would have been enhanced unemployment insurance at bars, restaurants, and nightclubs so that the servers would be able to make a living during another pause. But sadly, they elected to prioritize the commerce within bars, restaurants, and nightclubs over the lives of ordinary Arizonans. And as we know now, we have the highest per capita death rate in the entire country. And it's a direct result of the policy decisions that have been made by Governor Ducey and Director Christ. We had an opportunity to save many, many lives in Arizona by suspending the operation of bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. The governor elected not to do that. That was the big opportunity to save lives in terms of interventions during the pandemic. We're now in a phase where the cases, even the death rate, and the trajectory of the epidemic is improving greatly. And of course, we're all focused on vaccination. My primary cause at this point is to try to encourage the governor, Director Christ, to implement policies that are more equitable so that lower income communities have an opportunity to get vaccinated at the same rates that high income persons have been able to. And so far they've been unable or unwilling to implement those kinds of changes. They have done superficial things and created some, photo opportunities that make it appear as though they are working on that issue, but in fact they are not. I think we will probably in the end just have to suffer through this, and lower income people will be getting the short end of the stick. But to answer your question, we will be approaching herd immunity in, I would say, the middle of the summer. And at that point, we enter a new phase of the pandemic, which I'll call recovery. And that's a matter of looking at those sectors of the economy and those persons who were adversely affected during the pandemic and in a disproportionate way, and making sure that the financial investments that come with that additional federal money is used to really help the very people that suffered the most during the pandemic. I will use an editorial comment now and just say that I have zero confidence that the governor nor Director Christ will prioritize those communities that have been suffered such, during this pandemic. What I expect them to do is to do what they have done for the last year, which is to reinforce the financial position of their friends and contributors. And I don't have an answer for that, except to say we were just very unfortunate to have this team in office during the biggest public health crisis in the last 50 years, because of the decisions that they have made cost many lives and caused a whole bunch of unnecessary suffering. Well, I think at this point, we are now emerged from the huge surge in December, January, and February, when quite honestly, contact tracing, let me start with that. Contact tracing was of limited value just because there was so much community spread. We're now finally at a phase where the case counts are in the, let's say, 1,000, 1,500 per day. And therefore, we have enough, the case count is low enough so that case investigations and contact tracing can make a measurable difference in terms of the slowing of the spread of this virus. Testing will always remain a part of a responsible response to this pandemic. But as more and more people get vaccinated, I expect to see less and less demand for that kind of testing. And I would expect to see testing to transition more towards urgent care type of sites, primary care offices, et cetera, just because the more people that we have vaccinated, the less likely we will continue to see cases in the community. And so we are, I think, entering a good phase of this after we've been through hell in the last 3 months, in which, I expect to see the cases continue to decline. I expect to see immunizations continue to increase. I expect the disparities to continue because the governor, Director Christner, have no interest in the kind of equity that's important with vaccine distribution. But so there are problems with the situation that we have right now. But at least the worst is definitely behind us, and hopefully we have learned a lot as a community about the importance of vetting our elected officials and their appointees, because you never know when you're going to really have when you're going to need someone with compassion in these offices who is also talented and has a keen understanding of what it means to be a governor and a health director. But thank God that we've got a voter initiative within our Constitution, because this would be a very different state without it. We've done it over and over again. And it's not always the same group. It's different people doing this. It wasn't the Prop 206 people that raised the minimum wage was one group of folks. The people who did the Smoke-Free Arizona Act was a different group. The moving Medicaid up to 100% of federal poverty, that was a completely different group of stakeholders. It's not always the same group that does it. To get involved in your precinct, to get involved in your legislative district, to go to your district meetings, to help foster good candidates within your district, because I don't see this as a this year thing. In order to make real fundamental change with how Arizona functions as a state, we've got to change the makeup in the state legislature. And that means getting involved in your precinct, getting involved in your legislative district, running as a candidate if you think you're a good candidate, knocking on doors, registering voters, talking to them about what's important, talking to them about the importance of the state budget. If you spend your time on like the now, you're missing the opportunity to lay the groundwork. It's about the planning for the future that matters the most, not like what you're doing today about this year's budget, but rather what are you doing today to prepare for a state legislature in 2024 that will care about the things that you care about, that will elect a governor that cares about the things that you care about. And that means getting involved in your precinct, become a precinct committee person, go to those LD fill in the blank meetings, work your neighborhood. It's not glamorous, but it's what really matters.
So many great suggestions from Will on how we need to get engaged and be involved. And like you said, leadership really matters. We need to make sure that our elected officials show that leadership and act responsibly with the money that they've been entrusted with. So, David, do you have any other thoughts to fill in on the public health aspect of the budget?
I'll focus on one thing: kids care. Kids care is Arizona's children's health insurance program for low-income children. Arizona currently ranks 48th in the country in terms of the number of our kids that have health insurance coverage. And part of that is because our kids care program, the income eligibility level is about the lowest in the country. It's 205% of the federal poverty rate, whereas most states, the median is 255% of the federal poverty rate. So the Democratic caucuses in both the House and the Senate at the legislature have made it one of their top priorities to increase eligibility for kids care for low-income families so that more families will be able to get coverage for their children under the kids care program. It's a relatively low investment of about $7 million per year to increase coverage under kids care and get a lot more kids across Arizona with healthcare coverage under the kids care program. $7 million. Remember I mentioned we have a $400 million revenue surplus for ongoing funds. So this is an ongoing thing. So 7 million out of that 400 million is a small amount, but think of the difference it would make for children and families to get that many more kids covered under our health insurance program. There was an opportunity at the legislature just 2 weeks ago to pass an amendment to expand kids care. And the majority empowered, the Republicans did not vote for, not one person voted for that amendment to be able to increase kids care, and the amendment went down. And so now the Democrats are going to make it a priority in the budget negotiations to get that funding in there. But there needs to be that public pressure. Again, that's where elected officials need to hear from us, need to hear from the people that this is important, that it's a priority, and that we're paying attention. Because if they do, then we can get, we only need one to swing that balance. And so that's where it's important to raise that public pressure to get them to do the right things on these types of things.
We now have a zero COVID video, I think, to wrap up our public health segment.
The Zero COVID Alliance of Tucson is focused on attaining zero COVID in the community through advocacy, education, and partnerships. This pandemic has highlighted the lack of services flowing to our most vulnerable. We are working to close the communication gaps and increase the accessibility of COVID-19 services for those underserved communities. The Zero COVID Alliance of Tucson strongly supports the work of the Arizona State Budget Forum in helping the general public to understand the consequences the state budget decisions have on people and their communities.
Well, now we, having concluded the public health segment, we're going to move on to a segment on the health of the planet. And we're fortunate to have Laura Dent with us from CHISPA and League of Conservation Voters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Dunn. I'm the Executive Director of CHISPA Arizona. We're a program at the League of Conservation Voters, and our mission is to grow and elevate Latino voices, political power, and civic engagement for a cleaner future for us here as a credible voice during this really difficult pandemic experience. But this is a little bit about CHISPA Arizona. This is our cohort of organizers and activists. This is the first electric school bus in the state that is invested in by one of our high school districts. This is the Phoenix Union High School District. It's the largest high school district in the state, and it's 80% Latino serving. This is their first electric school bus, and they'll be getting their second one this year, along with the Cartwright School District in West Phoenix. So we've been organizing in these areas for a very long time and are excited to see some of these movements toward more electric transit and EV infrastructure for a cleaner, healthier future. If you could, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is what we call our political powerhouse. We try to do a lot of visuals so that the conversations around our strategies for building power are really accessible. So these are the three pillars that hold up our political powerhouse and our goal of really building Latino political power for a cleaner future in our state. The strategies that we use to make change are civic engagement, registering voters, but also educating community around what decisions get made at the state and local level, how people can get involved in the process. We have registered more than 40,000 voters since 2018 across the state in Pima County and Maricopa County and in Yuma County. So strategy 1, civic engagement. Strategy 2, grassroots organizing, meeting people in their communities. And the third piece across our family of organizations is advocacy and persuasión política. That is electoral, that is advocacy at the legislature, that is advocacy at the local level, working with municipalities to move the needle on more opportunities to fight for a cleaner and healthier future for our state. So this is a preview of what's happening at the legislature right now. These are some examples of what's going on. I know we're having big picture conversations about the budget, but we've really been tracking a number of efforts and issues around advocacy on behalf of our environment. We really feel strongly that democracy is a core pillar of environmental work. We've seen so much voter suppression come out of the legislature this cycle and in the past, but it's really been a torrent of effort to disenfranchise voters, and that, as we know, disproportionately impacts Latinos, communities of color, and young people. So we make that a pillar of our advocacy work. One of our affirmative budget priorities is investment in the Heritage Fund. The Heritage Fund was approved by voters in 1990. By about 62%, it invests $10 million a year of state lottery funds into parks projects, historic preservation projects that really tell the diverse story of our state. So many jurisdictions can apply for those resources and funds to create new trails in their community, to invest in park assets, to preserve important places of impact. For example, I know there's a lot of Tucson advocates on this call. The Marist College benefited from Heritage Fund resources. So that's just kind of one example of where these can go. But we're really committed to making sure that action items, we would love and invite folks to sign into the Request to Speak system and support $10 million in full funding at the Senate Appropriations Committee. That's on Tuesday. There are efforts right now to move the Heritage Fund full funding forward, and there's also efforts to scale that back so it kind of builds up, right? So it's 1 million in the first year, 2 million in the second year, and really voters approved this 30 years ago. Voters approved the full funding, and we would love to see it return to that level so we can invest in parks in our communities.
David, do you have any thoughts on the budget as it relates to what Laura was talking about?
I agree with everything Laura said. I mean, it's particularly the democracy issues are so important right now because although we're talking about the budget opportunities we have right now, as Laura said, this is very much, not just this year, but it's the long term. It's making sure that we have people that we're electing to the legislature that are going to put people first in these decisions. And the Heritage Fund is a perfect example of that. The voters, the people spoke, I forget how many years ago, but to fund the Heritage Fund. And that was one of the when they started cutting taxes and decreasing revenues, that's where that's an example of how they took money that voters approved and they've never replaced it. And so those are the types of things and the types of issues that we have to bring up to lawmakers consistently.
Well, so we will return briefly to the voter suppression bills, but first we will go to Ana Karina Rodriguez. She is the Arizona Civic Engagement Program Manager for the Domestic Workers Alliance.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Buenos dias. So good to be here in this space with all of our advocates for Arizona, for a better Arizona. I am a person who's full of energy. I am a Leo, so I'm going to bring it. This is where I stand comfortable and strong in my work in advocating for our community and ensuring that we stand up for the most vulnerable among us. So if I could have a slideshow, yes, perfect. Oh, I love how we're on the same page. So again, I'm Ana Karina Rodriguez. I'm with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I'm here. I am the Arizona Civic Engagement Program Manager. My email is below. If you ever need anything, please reach out. And I'm here to talk about demanding that we cover the needs for our whole community. So thank you so much. Next slide, please. All right, so everyone deserves to work with safety and dignity. And when workers come together, we are unstoppable. So who are we? We're the National Domestic Workers Alliance, also NDWA. We're the leading voice for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States. So when we say domestic workers, we mean nannies, home care workers, folks who take care of our kids, our elderly. These are the folks who come to our home, who we trust with our key under our doormat to come and make sure our homes smell fresh, smell like Lysol, like Pine Sol, like, it smells so beautiful when we come in our home, and it makes our work possible. We were founded in 2007, and again, we work for the recognition and inclusion of labor protections for domestic workers. The majority of whom are women and immigrant women of color. NDWA is powered by 60 affiliate organizations and local chapters. And that includes Puente, Arizona, actually here in Arizona. So you can see the connection and how NDWA is kind of like the umbrella of all the other domestic worker organizations and worker right organizations. Throughout the country, domestic workers do have the opportunity to join NDWA and gain membership benefits. They can connect with other workers and opportunities to get involved in the movement. Domestic workers are denied basic labor rights daily. There are 2.5 million nannies, house cleaners, and care workers who do the job of caring and cleaning in our homes. Domestic work is real work, and it's hard work, but it's work that makes our work possible. And so it's important for us to continue to advocate for domestic workers and all workers' protections across Arizona. Domestic workers bring order to our home, making it smell again fresh, clean. Maybe you ask them to make those taco dorados for you, so when you get home, you have a yummy meal to eat, Those are the people that really make our work possible, and they are taken for granted. At the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we have one Bill of Rights in 9 states, and it's time for all workers in all 50 states to have this protection. So what does this protection look like? Well, it includes domestic workers and common workplace rights and protection. This includes overtime pay, paid sick days, safe and healthy working conditions, meal and rest breaks, and freedom from sexual harassment, as well as privacy and other conditions. Next slide, please. This also includes new workplace rights and benefits, addressing the unique challenges of domestic workers, like written agreements, right? I mentioned we leave the key under the door, right, under the doormat. That's like the written agreement, right? Like, make sure you leave the key afterwards, right? But really don't have fair protections for domestic workers. Fair scheduling, right? I've heard stories of women who maybe have missed the bus, and they're not able to get to their job, and they lose their employment, right? It's one of the fastest growing workforces in America. It's one of those workforces that can't be, that mechanics and electronics can't come in and take over, right? We have the Roomba, but how much does Roomba really keep our houses in order so that we can continue to do the work that makes our work possible? Next slide, please. So ensuring that rights aren't just on paper, but that they can be enforced and implemented. So ensuring that rights are really enforced with, like, know your rights, implementation, preventing retaliation, and affordability of care. So these are some of the items that we would hope to have throughout the country. And these are possible rights that we can see here in Arizona as well. Next slide, please. So these are some of the protections that we can consider when we're talking about the Arizona budget, right? COVID-19 and workers' rights protections. This includes hazard pay for essential and frontline workers, including domestic workers, vaccination and continuous testing for essential workers, and offering masks and PPE to workers free of charge, and training for employers and workers on proper health and safety measures. Social services and community services. This includes support and fund community navigators, for example. This is like, right, if we had a wish list, like what would this look like if we were to include funding in the budget for our domestic workers? Access to nutrition and food subsidies. Other immigrant and refugee services for recent arrivals, such as connections with legal aid, food banks, etc. Citizenship classes and financial assistance for low-income families to assist with the application costs, including immigration-related legal services. enforcement of existing rights and curbing wage theft as well. So these are some of the things that we could continue to advocate for as we continue to see how, to continue to raise our voices for domestic workers. Next slide, please. So finally, we're asking you all to take action. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We're at Domestic Workers. You can follow us on our social media there. Again, these are some of the things that we are trying to advocate for at the national level with the National Bill of Rights. So join us as we continue to push for a National Domestic Bill of Rights into victory in hopefully 2022. So you guys can follow us. We also ask you to call your representatives. Laura dropped the link, thanks friend, and ask them to think about domestic workers and our workers' rights when considering protections for COVID-19, for example. Again, you can join us if you go to the website. You can find information about our membership benefits. So that's what this slide is for. Next slide. Let's do this, y'all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time and opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you so much for all the for the organizers who put this event together. I'm really appreciative to be in this space with you all.
David, do you have any thoughts about kind of the budget as it applies to this issue?
I would just say it's a good time to bring back up what I mentioned in my first presentation, and that is so many of our lawmakers right now talk about, and we hear it all the time, that we have to give these tax breaks to corporations and the rich because they're the job creators. No, they're not. It's the domestic workers who are the job creators. It's the everyday people that are out there working who are, and then when we improve their working conditions, when we improve their wages, put more money in their pockets, that they're the ones who go out and they're the ones who boost our economy and create our jobs. And so that's why, we've had our priorities upside down at the state capitol for too long. And I think that's kind of where our work has to be, is we have to kind of start shifting and remembering that it's the domestic workers, it's the working people that are the job creators in this country. And that's why we should be investing in them and in our communities.
That's absolutely right. All of you know that voting is incredibly important. Voting is how we keep our elected officials accountable and make sure that they are making the right choices and that they are actually working for us. The Arizona legislature is working incredibly, they're working hard, but they're pushing through a lot of bills that are actually seeking to decrease our access to voting. Instead of making voting easier for everybody, our legislature is pushing through some bills that is going to make voting harder. Many of these bills have now gone through one chamber of the Arizona legislature, and they have gone through committee in the other chamber. So unfortunately, even the RTS system is not available to us for these bills, like the one that Laura pointed out, SB 1485, are trying to push through bills that are going to kick people off the permanent early voting list. That's what this SB 1485 bill is. And it's at the point where it's going to take phone calls. Just a step back, we had an incredibly safe, secure election in 2020. It went really well. We had a record voter turnout, huge number of voters participating, and thanks also to the voter engagement and registration efforts of groups like CHISPA, et cetera. So we need to maintain that. We can't turn the clock back. And we need to be calling our representatives in the legislature to tell them how terrible it is that these bills are trying to roll back the right to vote. So it's this 1485, which is going to kick people off of the permanent early voting list. There's other bills out there that are going to try to prevent the ability for voters who forgot to sign their ballots from being able to fix their ballots so that they can actually get their vote counted. We really need to make those phone calls. Because now is the time. The legislators have one more chance and they're likely going to pass it, and then we need to make calls to Governor Ducey. We're also right now entering redistricting. This is once in every 10 years. Many of you are also already aware that this is super important because our districts are going to be redrawn. And what we need to do is be engaged with the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission to make sure that they make choices when they're drawing those district boundaries that aren't going to allow legislators to pick their constituents rather than the other way around. We need to make sure that every voter has their opportunity to have their voice and their vote reflected in who gets elected. So with that, and I get to introduce Fred Yamashita. He is the executive director of the Arizona AFL-CIO.
I'm going to talk about essential workers, and in defining essential workers, I think that it all depends on what lens you're looking through, that may determine who is deemed an essential worker. And then I think you can maybe look a little further into that to see why that list exists, and maybe some of the biases that create these lists. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security defines essential workers as those who conduct a range of operations and services that are typically essential to continue critical infrastructure operations. Critical infrastructure is a large umbrella form encompassing sectors from energy to defense to agriculture. The National Conference of State Legislatures created a list of essential workers, a map of essential workers, and it includes energy workers, child care workers, agriculture and food production, critical retail, critical trades, transportation. I think there's some glaring essential workers that are not included on this list. Where are teachers on this list? I just don't understand if you look at the again, the biases. This is the National Conference of State Legislators. Did they together feel that you could put childcare workers on this list, but not teachers? So I think, the plight of many of our workers today, and many of our workers don't have the voice or advocacy of a union to fight for them, to make sure that they are being given the consideration as an essential worker, so that they are treated accordingly, and that they are compensated accordingly. And so as the Arizona AFL-CIO, who represents 54 unions in the state of Arizona, we represent affiliates that represent a number of essential workers. And you come in contact with them every day. They're your letter carrier. They're your grocery store worker. They're the UPS driver, transportation workers, bus drivers, light rail operators, healthcare providers, first responders. These workers are represented by unions, and many of these unions are constantly having to fight and battle with our governor and many of the companies that they represent to make sure that those workers are being considered as essential and being compensated and treated accordingly. And so, to give you a little bit of information about what organized labor, or what unions the Arizona AFL-CIO is doing, as part of our regular activity during the legislative session, we convene what's called a unity labor table, and it consists of several of our unions nationally that organize these tables to monitor state legislatures, especially around bills and issues that are going to affect workers. And unfortunately, in a state like Arizona, since the inception of the unity table here in Arizona, about 7 years ago. We have basically played defense for our entire existence. We haven't had a majority at the Capitol so that we can develop and run legislation that would help working people in this state. Instead, we're constantly fighting all of the bad bills that you guys have been talking about, all of the voter suppression bills. Part of our table consists of our two education unions, the Arizona Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. So the budget is always a big part of our conversation. And, we often use David's organization to make sure that when we see a bill being introduced that is essentially giving our tax dollars away, how we best can analyze the bill and fight the bill and defeat the bill. So the budget is always a big part of the work that we're doing at the Unity Labor Table. Some of our members of the Unity Table belong to the building trades. Those are our electricians, our plumbers, our pipe fitters, boiler makers, carpenters. And so, in this state, they have really been put at a terrible disadvantage because of the ban on project labor agreements that exist throughout the country in most places, but have been ruled illegal to an extent here in Arizona. And all those things have been legislated away. And so we are constantly trying to rebuild the rights and protections for our building trades. There have been constant attacks on our union apprenticeship programs. Our union apprenticeships allow young people, a lot of young people, but the workers that enroll in apprenticeship programs, they learn a trade that stays with them a lifetime, and they earn actually a very livable wage while they're becoming a journeyman or an expert in their field. And so these are some of the attacks that our building trade unions are always under here in Arizona, and we're always fighting at the state legislature. We convene a weekly legislative meeting that is conducted by our political director, Joe Murphy. And that is open to anyone that would like to attend. We generally have 1 to maybe 3 or 4 state legislatures that report to us every week on what's happening at the legislature. And we get firsthand updates directly from our legislators on bills that we're focused on or that they themselves may be introducing or fighting. Many of you take part in those legislative meetings. I think Veronica can drop the link to those meetings. All are welcome to attend. And again, this is a focus on our state legislature, and many times, of course, the discussion will always be around our budget. The AFL-CIO nationally, of course, has been one of the largest proponents of the CARES Act and this third relief package because it does provide so many benefits to workers across the country, throughout our state, and it does intertwine with our state budget. And so I think, David maybe can make a few comments on that. And so the next large focus for the AFL-CIO is the PRO Act, which would be the largest, most beneficial piece of legislation for workers in this country for decades. it would basically do away with right to work as we know it. And there are many, many other related benefits for workers and their ability to organize into unions. We're asking everyone to make sure that you do get involved, that you're engaged. Just to give you an analogy that I think a lot of people may relate to. I used to be a person that said my vote didn't count, and that it didn't matter. When I got active with my union and got more involved and more educated, you learn, how untrue that statement is. But then you realize how many people really feel that way and act on that notion. And I think that it's all of our responsibility to continue to engage people so that those that have never been part of our political system, who've never had faith in our political system, can find that it is accessible and that it does matter. So with that, I'm sure that, I would actually like to hear if David had a little bit of information about how these national bills will affect our state budget.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before, I really see the American Rescue Plan and is landmark legislation in terms of providing the resources for our state and our communities to help lift people out of poverty. I think the key, though, is going to be, again, it's going to come to activists like us to make sure that those dollars get spent the way they're intended to be spent. For example, so the Joint Legislative Budget Committee estimates that Arizona will receive about $12 billion in American Rescue Plan relief. And they go to different pots of money. Some go to K-12 education, healthcare, different things. But Governor Ducey has control of about $4 billion that the legislature doesn't have even a hand in. It's really up to Governor Ducey. $4 billion worth of funds. And in the last federal relief package, Governor Ducey used $400 million of CARES Act money to basically pay state obligations that should have already been funded out of the general fund. So these were $400 million worth of federal dollars that should have been going out into the state to help people that are struggling through this pandemic. And he instead used them to basically pay state agency budgets to create some of that revenue surplus that we're talking about so that he can now pay for his tax cuts. So with that amount of money, as Fred said, it has the ability to really be transformational in our communities. But the key is we have to, all of us, make sure we are holding particularly Governor Ducey to task and making sure that those dollars are getting out as they are intended to be and not being used for things that are not going to help people that are struggling through this pandemic.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Fred, for your discussion as well. So we have reached the end of our set time. Do we have questions for ready to go?
Tax incentives, tax cuts. Yeah, what's the track record in terms of it? Producing jobs for Arizona residents and livable wage jobs.
That's part of the problem. Arizona does a horrible job of getting the data to see whether we're getting the promised return on investment for all the different tax incentives that we give. The biggest form of tax incentive that Arizona gives to corporations is through tax credits. And by statute, there's a joint legislative committee that's supposed to review tax credits every year to determine whether we're getting the promised return on investment. And that committee, which is supposed to meet every year and review the tax credits, has only met once in the last 6 years. 5 out of the last 6 years, they have failed to meet. And then even the 1 year that they did meet, they reviewed a number of the tax credits, and what they found is that when we give the tax incentives in the first place, we often don't require the corporations that are receiving them to provide the state with any sort of data to show whether they're delivering the promised jobs or other economic benefits. And you'll see legislators on both sides of the aisle when that committee actually meets, like scratching their heads and very frustrated and say, why aren't we collecting the data to see whether we're getting the promised return on investment? But yet they do the same thing over, and they keep giving out the tax incentives and they keep doing it without getting the data. And so that's I think there's a couple of examples that show that, we have data, but in most cases, the state, does a very poor job of collecting the data to determine whether they're actually creating jobs or doing what's promised.
David, just a follow-up question on that. Is that something the governor largely dictates, or does the legislature have a role in that?
That's the legislature. That's when they create these tax incentives, it's up to them to say to these corporations, okay, we're going to give you $5 million tax break to create jobs, but you have to provide us in the next 5 years evidence that you've actually created these jobs, and how many jobs have you created. And many instances have, they've shown where they don't collect that data. So we have no idea whether we're getting the promised jobs or benefits that were said that we were going to get.
Is there a role for a university or an outside party to track that data, or is that not really possible?
There is, and there's, the Arizona Commerce Authority there are some tax credits where they do it. Oftentimes, here's the thing, oftentimes they'll say that this is part of a non-disclosure agreement, that's proprietary information that only the Arizona Commerce Authority has, and they can't even share it with legislators who are supposed to review this. And so that's sometimes supposedly the Arizona Commerce Authority is getting some of this information, and we have to just sort of take their word for it that we're getting the promised return. But yes, I mean, it's not like we can't. I think it could be the universities, it could be the legislature. We could be getting this data if we wanted to, but it's up to the legislators when they give these incentives out to put the teeth in it to make sure we're getting that information.
Another follow-up question, or sorry, separate question. There's a stipulation in the Relief Act that the money can't be offset by tax cuts at the state level. How much leverage does that give us?
Yeah, that could be huge. We don't know exactly yet. We actually did a press briefing, our organization did yesterday. And first of all, kudos to the Congress and the president for including that in the American Rescue Plan, because I think that was in response to what Governor Ducey did with the last CARES Act money that I was mentioning. And so they have, and let me just be clear, they're not prohibiting states from cutting taxes. States can still go ahead and cut taxes, but what it says is that if the states do cut taxes, for every dollar of tax cuts, Arizona is going to lose $1 of this federal aid that we're getting. Mm-hmm. So it's, and the federal government, I think some of the Republican attorney generals have sued over this, but the federal government can do this and does this all the time, where they put strings on federal dollars and said, if you want to take federal dollars, you've got to follow these conditions. But hopefully that will be a disincentive to our legislators to pursue some of these tax cuts, because now for every dollar of tax cuts, it's a double impact. We are losing $2 because we're also losing $1 in federal aid that should be going to help struggling Arizonans. And the message is we shouldn't be cutting taxes during a pandemic when so many people are struggling. We should be investing in our communities, what we've been talking about today. And that's what that provision is all about. It's about saying you need to use these dollars to invest in your communities. You can't use these dollars to pay for tax cuts. That's
great. That's great. A question from Jay about the timeline for the funds actually reaching counties and cities. Does all of the funding funnel through the state, or does some of it come directly to the lower levels of government? And what's the timeline for all of that?
Yeah, it'll start flowing fairly soon. I'm not sure, but I think I've heard that most of it flows through the state, but some of it goes through cities. So I think there's different channels that it goes through, but I think most of it will go through the state. Most of it will go through the governor's office.
Hello, I'm Beth Morrison, CEO of Our Family Services in Tucson. Tax cuts in our community would mean, rather simply, fewer people, fewer families receiving life-sustaining services such as housing. More families would remain homeless, and others who are already vulnerable will become homeless. When budgets are cut by even a few $1,000s, that means at least one family isn't served. To some, that might seem okay, it's just one family. But the cost of that family into our system, both short-term and long-term, is immense.
Hello, my name is Kat Ripley, and I'm the recently elected member of the Pima Community College Board of Governors. One of our main issues from which all others stem is our budget. In 2015, in an unprecedented move by the Arizona State Legislature, backed by the governor, Maricopa and Pima community colleges were zeroed out of state funding. It states clearly in the Arizona State Constitution under Article 11, Section 6, that universities and all other state education institutions shall be as nearly free as possible. Well, this is impossible without any state funding. That move sent a bold statement to the nation that Arizona decided to turn its back on community colleges. At the same time, 17 other states were moving to make community colleges tuition free. The time is now, as we face a horrendous economic recession with millions of jobs lost and businesses closed, that we must support and fund our community colleges. For most of our population in southern Arizona, it is the last bastion of hope for people to recover and thrive in today's world. Thank you, and please urge your legislators to do the right thing.
Hi, I'm Betty Villegas, Executive Director for the South Tucson Housing Authority. And I have advocated for safe and decent housing that is affordable for all throughout my career. I believe that having a safe place to call home is a basic quality of life necessity. The current Arizona state budget does not adequately address the cost of housing for our homeless and working poor families. Home buying prices and rentals continue to rise, and wages have not kept up. The housing affordability problem existed before the pandemic, and all indicators and studies show it will continue to grow even worse. Many of our working families pay over 50% of their income for housing expenses. We must make sure that our voices are heard loud and clear. We must have a dedicated revenue source for the State Housing Trust Fund that will support the housing needs of all our vulnerable communities. We must advocate for fair and equitable landlord-tenant laws. This budget must include safe, decent, affordable, and just housing for everyone, regardless of where they live or how much they earn. This budget has many gaps, and they are all important. Please keep in mind that stable, secure, and affordable housing is the foundation on which all of the gaps stand on. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Eric Schindler, and I'm the President and CEO of Child and Family Resources. As a nonprofit here in Arizona, we know that access to childcare, preschool, and education is the most important thing that can occur to prevent poverty and promote economic self-sufficiency. Now, as we recover from a pandemic, we need our state not to cut taxes, but to be dedicating more resources to supporting the children and family that make our state great. Now is the time.
In determining laws and public policy in the state of Arizona guaranteed by the state's constitution. We need our legislative body to commit to human rights and civil rights in this state if we are to reach our potential as Arizonans.
I'm Matt Tarver-Walquist, the Executive Director at Literacy Connects. Literacy Connects works to fill the gaps found in Arizona's critically and chronically underfunded public education system. We stand behind the will of the voters to stop these tax cuts. The voters have said they want high quality, fully funded public education in Arizona, where right now our class sizes are the highest in the nation, our graduation rates are tied for lowest in the nation, and the arts programs, which research has shown are critical to children's development, have been completely decimated. Please stop these cuts.
Hi, my name is Leanne Hernandez and I work at the YWCA Southern Arizona. For the last year, I've been working from home, unlike so many of the families that we work with and support each year. Every week this last year, we heard from working moms and families who are struggling to make ends meet, who are struggling to put food on the table, who were past due on rent, utilities, medical bills. So as you negotiate and carve out this year's budget, I'm just going to remind you to remember the families and working people of Arizona. We Arizonans need accountability and investment in our collective future. We need fully funded schools, fully funded jobs training programs, childcare, and all of the safety net programs that are so essential to getting us back on track. We need you to be bold and say that working people who are struggling to make ends meet matter. Those who have been trying to pay past bills and rent and utilities, they matter. We can't keep waiting for trickle-down false promises. We need bold investment and courageous governance to create a new future for our state, one where we all have enough and we are able to thrive. So we're asking you, we're begging you, no, we're demanding that you build a people-first economy.
Governor Ducey and AZ legislature, do you see these roads? Stop lining the pockets of the rich with tax giveaways and start putting the money towards repairing our water lines, infrastructure, and streets. There are only so many more of these potholes I can take.